next session. Our second invited speaker, Sam Mehr, is joining us from Montreal, but via Zoom. He's the director of the Harvard Music Lab, and I was very happy to meet Sam Mehr just before the COVID pandemic started, when he visited Spotify and gave a really interesting talk that many people were interested in. One of the things that's really interesting about his work is he's multidisciplinary. So he is in a psychology department and works on questions that draw on insights from cognitive sciences, evolutionary biology, anthropology, ethnomusicology and music theory, linguistics, and computer science. And today, Sam is going to be talking to us about universality and diversity in human song. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Rosie. Let me just get my screen shared here. Okay. For people who are able or willing to do their own videos, feel free to turn yourself on so that I can see you as well. I'm going to do a little bit of interactive stuff in this talk just to demonstrate some of the effects that we're talking about. But by way of getting started, thanks again for introducing me. It's really great to be here. I've never been to Izmir before. I'm a psychologist and cognitive scientist by training. And while we work on music and audition, that generally means that I end up talking mostly with people in psychology, cognitive science, and not a lot of industry partners. So I'm really excited to do that. Just hanging out in the sessions today has been really exciting for me. I want to start with a little example. Which is an example of a machine listening application that I saw going around Twitter a couple of years ago. It's by John Hartquist. Are people familiar with this this Medium post? It was fairly popular. It's a simple classification problem, which is basically when you hear a sound, something like this. The question is just what instrument is playing that tone. It's an instrument classification task. And this post was really cool to me as a psychologist because this is a very constrained problem. You've got a fairly isolated tone that you're hearing, and you're making a very clear binary classification. Either it is this instrument or it's not from a set list of possible instruments. And John's solution to the problem is pretty elegant, I think. Basically, he generates a spectrogram on the fly using FastAI for this, and trains a image classification network on a big corpus of these images. And he's able to do really high accuracy classification of single tones played by instruments. That's the confusion matrix on the right side, and you can see it's like it's close to 100% accurate with a lot of these different sound categories. So this to me is a really interesting example, sort of sociologically, as a psychologist, because I study the psychology of music. My interest is in how we take vibrating air and turn it into neural signals, and then turn those neural signals into higher level representations that give us things like tonality and things like musical style and so on. And while this algorithm is working incredibly well, it's doing nothing like what my kind of day-to-day bread and butter work is. It's not doing anything like psychology. I might say, where is the psychology in this model? Now, that's not at all a criticism of this model. This model works really well. It's an elegant and efficient solution to the problem. Some people who might be, on a crusade to take down common practices in deep learning might be really against this sort of model. And actually, I'm not agreeing with that kind of view either. I think this is a great solution to the problem, but it raises a sort of puzzling question to me as a psychologist, which is when we're teaching machines to listen, what exactly are we teaching them to do? What are we trying to get our machine listening algorithms to extract from audio signals? This works really well in the constrained space, but when it comes to higher level problems in machine listening, things of the sort that humans do on a regular basis, and when we listen to music, when we produce music ourselves, and things that even young children or infants can do, is this sort of solution going to be enough, or do we need to train these machine listening models to do things more like what the psychology of music does? Those higher level problems are things like auditory scene analysis, melody and rhythmic segmentation, getting motifs out of the music that we hear, inferring harmonies that aren't necessarily present in the auditory signal, so things like implied harmony, even higher level representations like tonality and meter, style classification, something that's very, very well studied in industry, but that we don't really yet understand the psychology of. And even higher level than that, things like aesthetics and preferences through recommendation. So what I'm going to try and get across today in the talk is not that I have any answers to any of these questions, because I don't, but more to get across the general point that the psychology of music has quite a bit going on that we're only beginning to understand. And that I think as we continue to understand some basic facts about this psychology of music, especially its universal aspects, the ones that turn up in minds all over the world, regardless of their experience or their location or language, as we understand those things more, I think the results are going to be very informative for teaching machines to listen more like humans do. Okay, so I think the psychology of music can help. But we have a problem here in the psychology of music, which is that in a sense, a lot of psychologists have sort of fallen down on the job because we don't really know what is the psychology of music, at least in a universal sense. And this is because of two main problems in my field. The first is one that's probably familiar to many of you. This problem is known as the weird problem in psychology and cognitive science, where weird is an algorithm for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. And it turns out that for the vast majority of scientific history, we've been studying weird people and not everybody else. And the problem for understanding a psychology of music, of course, is that the minds of people who happen to live in big industrialized places are also human minds, just like the minds of people who don't live in those places. And in fact, the people that we study quite often in psychology and in the psychology of music only represent a small slice of the minds that we would actually like to understand if we were going to build a comprehensive model of how we hear and understand music. So that's problem number one. Now, one way around that problem is, well, just don't do that, right? Study a wider, more representative sample of music production and perception. But there we run into a second problem, which is that there is a lot of work on these topics. We know that there's music that is produced in many different cultures. We know that there are people listening to music and interpreting music in many different cultures, but there aren't any centralized repositories of this information. So it's not like there's a database of every song that's played in every society that we can just go to and analyze and try and figure out how the psychology is working here. Instead, these resources are distributed. They're in libraries and archives, and they tend to be in lots of formats that are not sort of convenient for using, for instance, machine learning on. So this is a problem that my lab has been spending quite a bit of time trying to solve. We have a group of different projects that fall under the aegis of what we call the Natural History of Song project. Our data sets and audio are on the Open Science Framework if you're interested in working with these data sets. And the goal of this set of projects in general is to get at that basic universal psychology of music. What is it? What are the basic facts of our music perception and production abilities? And in the talk today, I'm going to give essentially a little grab bag of some of our findings to introduce you to some of the insights that we've come to with this cross-cultural data science approach. We're going to go on a few little adventures in cross-cultural data science. And in particular, I'm going to look at a case study that we've been quite interested in, which is listeners' inferences about unfamiliar music that comes from places they've never been to, that is sung in languages that they don't understand. And I'm going to ask a few different questions about this phenomenon. So first, what is it that listeners understand about the music that they hear? Do they get anything out of this experience, even though the music is very foreign to them? If so, if they are getting information out of this music, what are the features that make that music universal? How is it that listeners' experiences affect their inferences? And in particular, we can take advantage of the fact that children and infants have a very limited amount of experience relative to adults with the musical world. So if we study their perception and their inferences about unfamiliar music, it tells us a bit about the effects of experience on these abilities. And I'll also mention a bit about the physiological effects that this sort of music produces on young listeners, even though they might lack experience. And then just to wrap up the talk, once I've got through all of that stuff, I'm going to talk a little bit about some new data that gets at a possible application of these findings to understanding musical aesthetics, which has sort of a clear application in recommendation engines, because we want to know, for instance, is it likely that user A is going to like this piece of music more than user B? Is user B going to like a different piece of music? And I think understanding the psychology of musical aesthetics may well help us to design better recommendation engines. Okay, so to dive right into the first topic here, what is it that listeners understand about the music that they hear? To study this question, we built a corpus of audio recordings. We call it the Natural History of Song Discography, or the NHS Discography. It has music from 86 different societies, and what's important about these societies is that they tend to be small scale. So they're not internet-connected societies. They tend to be hunter-gatherer groups or pastoralists. And the reason that's useful is that it provides us a sample of singing in its essentially most kind of basic form in the style of music that has been present throughout much of human history. And the songs come from four behavioral categories: dance songs, healing songs, love songs, and lullabies. They're categorized by the anthropologists or ethnomusicologists who collected the recordings. And they're done so not on the basis of their acoustical features, but on the basis of what the songs are actually used for when they're performed in those societies. So for instance, a lullaby would be classified by the anthropologists as this is a song that a mother or father sings to a baby to get it to go to sleep. That's the classification scheme here. And the first thing we did with this corpus once we had built it, this was a couple of years ago now, was a simple naive listener experiment. And what we'll do just for fun is try and run this with everybody here. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the experiment, and then we can all be participants in it. What we do is quite simple. We play people a short snippet of a song drawn at random from the audio that we have from that song. We ask them to rate how much they think the song is used for a particular behavior. Those behaviors correspond to the different categories of songs that we actually have. So those are things like used to soothe the baby, used for dancing, used to heal illness, and so on. And then we just do this a bunch of different times. We play them lots of songs and get lots of ratings. This is what the measure looks like. And I have a couple of recordings here. So I'm going to open up a polling window. I'm going to play you three different excerpts. And rather than ask you all this, all of the four questions for each item, we'll just focus on one, the lullaby one. So you should be able to see now a poll. Can you see that? Is that popping up on people? Okay, cool. So there's three questions. Each question corresponds to one audio example. So I'm going to play you the first audio, and you should answer the first question for that. The question is, think of the singers and rate whether you think the singers do not use the song to soothe the baby, do use the song to soothe the baby, or somewhere in between. So here we go. Let's try it. Okay, go ahead and enter a rating on that first example. Okay, and I'm going to play the second example now. So use the second question for this one. Same question though for the second example. Okay, same question. Do you think the singers are using that song to soothe the baby or not? And here comes a third example. Okay, go ahead and enter your responses and submit them when you're all done. I'll give it another just a couple of seconds for everybody to submit, and we'll see if we're able to replicate the result of this experiment. Now, of course, I've only played you three examples in the paper that I'm going to give you the results from. In a minute, we did this with 118 songs from that whole corpus. Okay, here are the results. You should be able to see a result now. And what you'll find, can you see that result? Is that showing up for you? No. Okay, let me share that then. I'll just stop mine and share this one here. I'll just share my whole desktop for you so that you can see it. So here's the poll results. For the first song, there's quite a peak on the do not use to soothe the baby side here. Second song, it's a bit more disagreement, somewhere in the middle. The peak's just north of the median of the scale. And then the last song, there's quite a big peak at using the song to soothe the baby. So the point of this description is not just that there's quite a bit of agreement among users. You can see each of these distributions has sort of a clear peak, but also that the intuitions that you had about these songs are correct. The first song is not at all used to soothe the baby. It's a healing song. The second song is a love song, which is why it sounds a bit more like a lullaby. Love songs and lullabies tend to be more similar to one another than healing songs and lullabies. And the last song is indeed a love song, a lullaby, and that is the rating that everyone went for. So let's look at the data from this experiment at scale. Let's just get that going here. Okay. So in our first paper on this, we ran this experiment with 750 workers on MTurk. Get rid of that. These are the locations of those MTurk workers. They come from 60 different countries, and each of them listened to 36 excerpts. So this works out to quite a few listens for each song, giving us an average rating on each of the dimensions that we measured. So what do we find? In this plot, each point is going to be the average rating of each song. So there'll be 118 songs on this plot. And in this first plot, we're looking at whether songs are rated as used to soothe the baby. Higher means more used to soothe the baby, lower is less used to soothe the baby. And I'm just going to group the songs based on what the songs are actually used for in the cultures where they were performed. So whether they were used for dance, healing, love, or lullaby. So the first finding is when people are actually listening to lullabies, even though they're from foreign places and foreign countries, they really can tell that they're listening to lullabies. They rate them much higher on this rating used to soothe the baby. They rate other song types like dance songs and healing songs relatively low on this rating relative to the global mean, which is the dotted line here, suggesting that dance songs and healing songs are really perceived as not for soothing babies. What about the other measures that we have here? When we ask about whether songs are used for dancing, we get exactly the opposite effect. Dance songs are rated very highly across these cultures. Lullabies, the entire distribution of lullabies that we have is below the global mean, suggesting that lullabies are really not for dancing. What about some of the more subtle effects here? Well, healing songs, which many MTurk workers probably don't have a general concept for. I mean, I certainly don't have an idea of what a healing song really is. Even there, our MTurk workers have some intuitions for this. They rate healing songs as used for healing more than the other three song types and more than the global average, although the effects here are smaller. In the last category, love songs is the only area where we didn't have any kind of overall effect. These maybe are the most ambiguous songs coming from these small-scale societies. So the takeaway here is that naive listeners so far seem to have some pretty good intuitions about the music that they hear from around the world. Now you might be wondering how consistent these effects are. And we can ask that across different groups of listeners. So we have this whole world full of MTurkers. They fall into three general cohorts: the Americans, the Indians, and everybody else. This is a bit of a coarse distinction between users, of course, but it's a first pass. And there's 250 users in each of these cohorts. And we're just going to ask, how do their impressions of the songs compare to one another? So we can plot them in three-dimensional space. I'll just use the soothe the baby dimension again here. If the three cohorts really agree with one another on their representations of what the singers are doing while they're performing these songs, we should see a diagonal line along the cube here. If they disagree with one another, we should see some cloud of points or some other pattern. Here's what we find. Again, each point here is a song's average. The green ones are actually used as lullabies. The gray ones are the other three song types. And what we find is that the three cohorts of listeners really agree with one another on what seems to be used to soothe the baby and what doesn't. With quite a high rate of agreement. We see a similar pattern when we ask them whether songs are used for dancing. Here the blue songs are dance songs and the gray songs are the other ones. Similarly high agreement. And even the healing songs, where their accuracy overall is quite a bit lower than the dance songs and lullabies, there's still a good deal of agreement, although there's a bit of skew in this line, which you can see as the GIF turns around a little bit. Okay. We decided we wanted to replicate this in a much bigger sample, and this was motivated by a bit of popular press that was done about this paper. So this was a New York Times article that was written about our first paper on this, and one of the things that the Times did when they reported this, which was kind of fun, is they decided to let their readers try it for themselves. So they made a little game that said, "Listen to the song, tell us what you think." And in the space of a week, they had something like 500,000 participants. So we said, well, if the New York Times can do it, we ought to be able to do it ourselves. So we launched a citizen science platform in my lab, which some people here may be familiar with. This is at themusiclab.org. You're welcome to try it out right now if you're bored with my talk. We have a bunch of different music perception games on here, and this is one of the primary means by which my lab collects cognitive science data. And one of our first games on here was called the World Music Quiz, and it was very simple. We just play people songs from that discography, and we asked them to guess what kind of song they were listening to. So it's a slightly different measure. It's a forced choice categorization and not a rating scale. And I'll just show you the results here. Along the x-axis, along the y-axis is the actual song type, and across the x-axis is the guess that they make. One thing to draw your attention to before I show the results is that the response rates to each type are not evenly spread. So there's a bias towards guessing healing songs, which might indicate that people are sort of unsure of what healing songs are in the first place. There's a bias against reporting love songs. So that's why we have this column here for D prime scores, which are going to adjust for those response biases. So what do we find? When people are listening to dance songs, they guess that they are dance songs much more than you would expect based on their response bias. Same deal for lullabies, even higher than the dance songs after you adjust looking at the D prime score. Healing songs, like the first paper's smaller effect, but still quite clear recognition of them. And in this case, even love songs were recognized more accurately than the base rate of love song responses, although the effect here is much, much smaller than it is in lullabies and dance songs. Okay, so I think we can take away from those two experiments that adults, when they're listening, have a psychology of music that leads them to make reliable, high-level inferences about the music that they hear. There's not any information present in this auditory signal that says, that directly represents a person who's singing to a baby, but they make inferences that show that they know that that's happening. Okay, so you might be wondering, what is it about the songs that are turning up around the world that make that possible? What is it about this sort of music that lets users, our users of our website and listeners online, lets them know, like, what is it that cues them into this? So to ask that question, in our science paper last year, we were particularly interested in the acoustical features of these songs. But there we ran into a problem, which is very familiar to anyone at the ISMIR conference, which is that it's not straightforward to represent musical features in raw audio in a way that satisfies anybody who might be reading the paper, or in a way that satisfies psychologists or musicologists or music information retrieval folks. So what we decided to do was throw the kitchen sink at this problem and analyze these songs every way we could think of. So first we used some straightforward MIR tools. We used the MIR toolbox and some of the Pentelli et al. Features from a cross-cultural study using music information retrieval. We use naive listener ratings of the sort that we collected in the current biology paper. These are ratings where someone on MTurk will just say, oh, this song sounds fast, or this song sounds complicated or sad. Then we had a group of expert annotators. These were PhD level musicians mostly, who annotated really high level things like not just is it fast or slow, but what's the exact tempo in beats per minute. Things like, is there a key center and how consistent is that key center? Things like, what's the degree of repetition in the rhythmic features relative to the melodic features, those kinds of things. And then last, the most labor-intensive thing is that we actually transcribed all of the songs in the corpus into staff notation, and then we did a feature extraction on those staff notation transcriptions to get things that even an expert listener isn't so great at detecting, things like what's the pitch density or the average interval size, or the range of pitches in a song. So these are the raw data that are going into trying to figure out what is it that makes these songs similar to one another across all these different societies. And the approach that we took here is, because we wanted a strong test of the universality of these features, we used a lasso classifier that is regularized across regions. So we train the model on 29 of the 30 world regions that we have songs from. We've got 4 songs from each of those world regions, one of each category. So it's learning from everywhere else in the world except for this odd one out, and then it's guessing each of these song pairings in the 30th region. Then we rotate the model across all these world regions, and we ask which are the features that most consistently work across all of these different world regions to accurately classify the pairings. So again, this is a strong test of universality because the model doesn't know anything about the world region where it's being evaluated on. Okay, so what do we find? Here's for comparing lullabies to each of the other song categories. Across all societies, the model is able to distinguish lullabies from dance songs on average way, way higher than chance and approaching the level of human listeners. The model's not quite as good as human listeners are. And what we find is that across these societies, lullabies have slower tempos and fewer rhythmic accents. This is not so surprising to anyone who has a baby or has sung to a baby before. These are things that you do kind of intuitively. And it also has a less consistent meter, sort of intuitive when you think about what dances are used for, with lots of groups doing things in coordinated actions. Relative to healing songs, we find that lullabies have fewer rhythmic accents and more minor key qualities. This might be surprising to American listeners. A lot of American lullabies tend to be in a major key. A lot of European lullabies tend to be in minor keys, though, so maybe that's just an American bias or my own bias, I'm not sure. They also seem to have fewer unique pitches. Healing songs tend to have I think that's reversed. Healing songs tend to have fewer unique pitches. They tend to have fewer pitches in general. And they tend to be more in triple meter. Relative to love songs, this is the hardest comparison. Love songs are often of like sort of a soothing, calming nature in the same way as lullabies. So, but even here across cultures, the model is able to distinguish these two, where lullabies have less rhythmic accents and a narrower pitch range. Now, we can make a map like that across all of these different song pairings. I won't walk you through all of them, but there's a big table in the paper. The takeaway that I want to give you from this is that these high-level inferences that adults are making are rational. They're based on universal features of musical forms and musical behaviors that turn up around the world. And we know they're rational because when we throw lots of different representations of the music in these songs at a sort of hypothesis-blind, sort of equivocal model like this lasso classifier, it's able to work in a similar fashion to our naive listeners. Okay. So moving on, I'm going to present all of that stuff you may already know because this work's been out for a little while. And I'm going to move on to some new findings, which I'm pretty excited about. And these center around whether there might be some effect of listening experience. So you might be hearing those results and saying, okay, your listeners on MTurk and on your citizen science page, they've had years and years of experience listening to music. They know what a lullaby is from their own culture. Big deal. So we wanted to take that possibility seriously. And one way to measure whether listening experience is playing a big role in these effects is to ask, when you test people who have much less experience, do you get the same result? So just to measure directly, what is the effective experience on these results? So to do this, my student, Liam Crowley-Datiri, is working on a project where he analyzes children's developing musical inferences. This is also a web-based project. So if you go to our website right now, one of our featured games is the Kids Music Quiz. And it's essentially a child-friendly version of the science results that I just showed you. Children hear a song, they're walked through a practice session with a little animated character who's going to play the child a bunch of different songs. They learn how to do this response with familiar songs, so with a happy birthday song, for instance. And then they're played a selection of songs from the discography and are just asked, do you think this is being used to soothe the baby? Do you think this is used to make a sick person feel better? Or do you think this is used to get people to dance? Okay, so what do we find? In this plot on the y-axis for each of the panels, I'm going to show the percent of responses from children on each of the 118 songs, and I'm going to plot them as a function of the percent of adults choosing them. So the question is, how similar are the kids to the adults? If they agree with the adults often, we should see straight lines. If they disagree, we should see some other pattern or a cloud. This is in just under 2,000 children who did the study over the last 6 months or so on our website. Here's the result. Children are remarkably similar to adults in their perceptions of these songs. the R-squares are very, very high. And you can see from the color coding of these plots that within each category of songs, just the children alone are reliably identifying lullabies, dances, and healing songs. One thing I forgot to mention is that we didn't give kids love songs in this experiment, just because we thought it would be a bit confusing for the very young children who don't necessarily have a concept of what a love song is. So we just left them out of the experiment entirely. Okay, so that's an initial test of effects of experience. Children are looking a lot like adults. So you might be wondering, well, you've got a lot of kids here, maybe kids are teenagers or something, and they actually all do have a lot of experience. Well, we can measure across different age groups how accurate their representations are of these songs. And we turned out to have quite a good distribution of children going as young as 3 years old, and we have about 100 kids per age bin. So if there's a big effective experience, you might expect a line that looks something like that, where the youngest kids are performing at or below chance. And as they grow up and they get lots and lots of exposure to songs, they get better and better at this task. That turns out to be nothing like what we find. We get a big fat null result for this experiment. So the advantage that a 12-year-old has over a 3-year-old at inferring what songs are being used for turns out to be like 1 or 2 percentage points. Very, very, very small effect. So little that the R squared is almost indistinguishable from 0. Okay, so what do we take from that? Well, that's a bit of evidence, I think, that the high-level inferences that listeners are making about unfamiliar music don't actually require substantial experience, or at least don't require substantial experience after the age of 3 or 4. So then you may be wondering, okay, well, what happens between age 0 and 3 or 4? Because infants hear a ton of music. We have a toddler. We sing to him all the time, and anyone on the call who has one probably does the same. So to ask that question, we ran another study. This is led by my students Connie Bainbridge and Mila Bertolo. And in infants, of course, we can't just ask them, what kind of song are you listening to? But we can ask whether their physiological responses to the music that they hear map onto the expected physiological responses that they would hear for a given category of music. Now, of course, for infants, a reasonable category to use is lullabies, because we know that infants hear a lot of lullabies. But what will happen to these infants if they hear lullabies that are in a foreign language and are coming from a culture that they're totally unfamiliar with? So that's what we asked in this experiment. So the experiment's quite simple. These characters might look a little bit silly or strange or maybe a bit scary to you, but they're quite common in developmental psychology studies. Shapes with eyes tend to be reliably recognized as people who can produce sounds. So we took advantage of that fact in the study. We introduced the infant to 2 characters. And over the course of a few minutes, the infants learn that one character tends to sing lullaby things, and the other character tends to sing other stuff. So in this counterbalancing condition, you'd see, for instance, the blue character sing a lullaby, the red character sing some other kind of song, and then we just show them the characters together, and we repeat this a bunch of times such that each infant hears 8 songs total. Okay, what are the songs? Well, we wanted to play them everything from our corpus, but infants' time in the lab is a bit limited because they'll only sit in an experiment for so long. So we picked 16 songs from the NHS discography. We used an algorithm to essentially limit the corpus to songs that were quite well matched in a few properties that we thought would be important to control for in this study. So the first one is that we only wanted solo singers and no accompanying instruments, so that this was really going to be about voices and about the pitches and rhythms that the voice was producing and the style in which the voice produced them. We also wanted to match perceived gender, because infants are quite sensitive to their estimates of the gender of the voices that they hear. So we used songs that were, half of the songs were from male singers and half of the songs were from female singers, and each infant only got one half or the other. So there was no confound of gender in this selection. The songs come from 15 different cultures, so not quite as good as our 86 cultures in the original corpus, but it's our best shot for an infant study. I'll just play you one example here. So that's one song, and then we'd hear another one. Okay, so and that's an example of a pair of singing trials. After that, they would see a silent trial where they just look at the characters and have a chance to look at both of them at the same time or go back and forth between them, and then they would hear another set of songs. In case you were wondering, the little screensaver-like thing adjacent to the singer is just a distractor. Infants tend to become very fixated on anything interesting that's happening in front of them, and we wanted to make sure that they weren't only staring at the singer, to give us a bit of a measure for how much attention the singer was giving them, to get them off of like ceiling stare the whole time. It gave them something else to look at as well. Okay, so what do we find? Well, the main measure of interest that we had here was infants' heart rate. So we hooked infants up to a heart rate monitor. I should have included a photo of this because they're pretty cute. Basically, it goes on the infant's foot with a couple of electrodes and a light sensing heart rate monitor. It's basically like an Apple Watch on steroids, much fancier version of electrophysiology. And we use heart rate because heart rate in this kind of context is a very reliable measure of how infants are either relaxing or not relaxing. We know both among infant listeners and adults that if you sit in a quiet space and you listen to something nice, your heart rate tends to drop. In this graph, I'm just going to plot the average trial-wise heart rate across all of the infants over the course of a 15-second trial. And this is all normalized to what had just happened. So negative scores indicate a drop in heart rate relative to the prior period. Positive scores indicate an increase. So as you might expect, they're sitting in a comfortable chair in a nice spot and they're listening to music. Their heart rates drop as they listen to this music overall. But the question is, do their heart rates drop in a different fashion when they're listening to songs that are actually used as lullabies in the cultures where they came from, despite the fact that the infant, of course, knows nothing about these cultures and doesn't speak the languages? And the answer is yes. So across all the songs, there's a drop in heart rate, but when the songs are actually used as lullabies where they were recorded, the drop is larger. And the drop stays below the drop for non-lullabies for a period of a few seconds, a large chunk of this trial length. It's a large enough effect that if you just take the average heart rate across all of these trials and plot it across the two song types, you see a main effect where lullaby heart rates are dropping overall. There's a difference from zero in lullaby heart rates, and not happening in the non-lullaby case, such that there's a within subjects difference here. Okay. And one other thing I want to point out here is that we can do a similar style analysis to our kid regression there, where I looked at the size of the effect across ages. We can ask, even in the first year of life, they're getting a lot of experience. Is it the case that maybe the older infants are relaxing more because they've had more experience hearing lullabies from mom or dad? Do they have a larger effect than the younger infants? And we have 144 infants here over the course of 2 to, I think, 14 or 16 months. Do we see that effect? And the answer is no. The youngest infants have just as large a drop in heart rate as the oldest infants. This regression line is no different than zero. It's essentially a big cloud of points. So that suggests to me that the fact that people do not require substantive experience in order to make inferences about unfamiliar music, that also seems to be reflected in these early appearing physiological effects on young listeners. Now, I wouldn't say that these young infants have a concept for what a lullaby is. They probably couldn't tell us, oh yeah, that one was a lullaby and that one wasn't. But the implicit measure that we have of their physiological arousal suggests that they're hardwired, in a sense, to respond in this way to the musical features that universally make lullabies what they are. Okay, so in my last few minutes, I just want to mention one new project that I'm pretty excited about and that I think is a really kind of promising area, especially for industry academia collaborations, because those of us working in industry have so much access to really beautiful naturalistic listening data and user behavior. And that's musical aesthetics. So we know that lots of people listen to music because they like it. That's nothing surprising. And one of the cool exploratory findings from my lab over the last couple of years has looked at what the patterns are of pitches and rhythms that are actually produced across these many different societies. So music is being used in some kind of aesthetic way in these societies. And the question is there some kind of overarching rule about what kinds of things turn up in music and what kinds of things don't? We know from a lot of beautiful research, one great example is this Nature paper from Josh McDermott's lab, that there's variability across societies in what kinds of sounds people tend to report as sounding nice or not. In this case, Chimane listeners in Bolivia who have very little exposure to Western music have different responses to pairs of consonant or dissonant tones, consonant or dissonant in the sort of Western music theory sense. So we know that there's some variability here, but I wonder if that variability might mask some of the sort of general rules. So what might those rules even look like? One possibility is something like Zipf's law, where the probability of an event occurring in a distribution of events is inversely proportional to its frequency rank. So this law turns up in a lot of different places. Anybody on the call who took a linguistics class ever probably saw this. This is a figure from a Stephen Pianedossi paper, but the classic example is natural language. The words that appear in, for instance, fiction books are Zipf distributed. And what that means is that a few tokens like the or and turn up in almost every sample that you gather, and a very, very long tail of other words are extremely rare. But nonetheless, every time that you take a sample of words, you're likely to find at least a few rare examples. Now, Zipf himself, in 1949, noticed that music followed this description, or at least one example of music, the Mozart Bassoon Concerto. And because we had gone to all of this effort in our Natural History of Song paper to analyze music from all of these different societies, we said, why don't we try and see if this distribution turns up there as well? And what we find is not exactly Zipfian, but it's Zipf-like. So in these two panels, I'm going to plot the distributions of melodic bigrams, so tonal intervals, and rhythmic bigrams, so the relative durations of each successive pair of notes. And what we find is that indeed they're distributed like a power law. There's some argument over whether it's actually Zipfian or just kind of close to Zipfian. But the general point is a small number of tokens appear incredibly frequently. Now, as a musician, I was sort of wondering, what are the tokens that turn up really frequently? Well, in melodies, the really common ones are small steps, unisons, whole steps, and minor thirds, the kinds of things that turn up in diatonic scales worldwide, including pentatonic scales. In rhythmic bigrams, the things that turn up most frequently are simple integer ratios, repeated durations, 1 to 2, 2 to 1, and 1 to 3, 3 to 1. So this is a fairly exploratory finding, and there's all sorts of biases inherent in our analysis here that need to be followed up on for sure. But it raises the possibility that there might be some regularities in musical aesthetics worldwide. Keep in mind that each set of observations that are being analyzed in these data sets come from a culture that has never contacted another culture elsewhere and in our corpus. And these distributions repeat over different regions in our corpus. So following up on that sort of general possibility of regularities in musical aesthetics, which I think is kind of a controversial possibility, that like different people might find the same things nice to one another in music, is like sort of runs counter to my intuitions, where a lot of people might have disagreements about that. We have a little project that we're getting started now, being led by my students Mila Bertolo and Jan Simpson, where we're looking at cross-cultural variability in listener preferences for music. So on our citizen science page, we have a bunch of different games that use that same corpus. And one item that we really like to ask people just for fun is some iteration of, did you like what you just heard? So in some games we ask, how much did you like it? In other games we ask, how much did you enjoy it? Sometimes we ask, is it pleasant or unpleasant? But across the board, it's some kind of valence, how good was it for you measure. So we've got this now from 250,000 participants across that corpus. And many participants listen to many different songs, so that works out to quite a few ratings. And in our first analysis, and I'm going to apologize in advance for the quality of the graphs that you're about to see because we only just made them this week, we see some interesting patterns. So the first thing is, if you look across all the songs in a subset of listeners, you see a lot of variability. So this is a forest plot where each line is the distribution of ratings, the mean and standard deviation of ratings for a given song. There's 118 lines here. Each one is a song. And this is only looking at US listeners. And this might not be that surprising. Some songs are nicer than others to our US listeners. This guy over here, is, fairly low. This one over here is fairly high. Now, if we look at other countries of listeners, we see a similar distribution. Here's Argentina, lots of variability. Here's Indonesia, also lots of variability. This is not too surprising. What we were surprised by is when we group not by song, but by country. And we ask for a given song, how do different listeners from different countries agree or not on how they like this song? So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. This is song number 26. And I've plotted the mean and standard deviation of ratings from 25 countries from which we have like a fair number of participants. This is, again, pretty sketchy, but what you can see, sketchy in terms of the number of participants in the smaller countries, and still a rough plot, but you get the idea. This is a lot more variability here than what we see here. So song-wise variability is high, country-wise variability is low. I'll just play you this song. This is a song that most people across these countries were not crazy about. Whoops, is that playing for you? Sorry, let me unshare and reshare to make sure that that audio box is checked. Just because I want to make sure you can hear this. Oops, sorry about that. Zoom seems to have locked up for just a second. Okay, there you go. Okay, here's song 26, and I'll just play it for you. So this song was rated as fairly unpleasant by a large number of listeners in a consistent fashion across societies. Here's one that's more towards the middle of the scale, song 18. And here's one that was quite uniformly rated very positively, song number 61. And the thing I want to have everyone keep in mind about these recordings is, again, this is coming from unfamiliar genres, unfamiliar languages, unfamiliar places. And what that means is it lets us study in a fairly distilled fashion some of the kind of core components of musical aesthetics, because listeners aren't bringing anything to this listening session that they already know about the music that they hear. That's a key confounder for lots and lots of studies of what people like or don't like in music, is that they bring their own prior experience to it. In this case, we're eliminating that prior experience because we're using a corpus of obscure recordings, many of which are coming from, distant libraries and archives that people wouldn't even have had the opportunity to listen to before. So this is very initial results, but one thing we wanted to do was just a quick pass at quantifying the difference between variability in song-wise ratings and country-wise ratings. And it turns out that there's a method to do this. It comes from behavioral genetics or evolutionary genetics. And we simply take the variance when we bin in these different ways and create a ratio. So for each song, we ask, is the ratio of within country variability larger or smaller than between country variability? So is it the case that countries differ from one another, or listeners differ from one another within a country? And when we do that, we find that the distribution is way, way, way larger than 1. So this is an estimated distribution of the population of song-wise ratios. So this is a group of songs from our corpus. And what we find is that way more often than not, songs are perceived as pleasant or unpleasant in a higher degree of variability within groups of listeners, but in a similar fashion across countries. It doesn't matter where in the world our listeners are, they seem to agree with one another about how nice these songs are that they're listening to. Okay, this is a very initial result. Don't take it to the bank, but it's something I'm kind of excited about, in particular because places like Spotify and Pandora and Deezer have tons and tons of reliable and interesting information about what it is that people like about the music that they hear. And that suggests to me that when we get from these studies of the basic universal psychology of music to higher level things like what people enjoy or not in music, we might well be able to apply some of those findings to these high level machine listening algorithms, which I think are in reach, but we aren't quite there yet. I think a lot of the music information retrieval and different machine listening paradigms that we're using are still skewed a bit away from psychology because it's just so hard. Psychologists don't even know what's going on. So, our machine learning algorithms definitely don't know what's going on yet. But I think the thing that I'm really excited about doing work in this area now is that we now have the kinds of data and analyses and new findings in psychology and new methods coming from machine learning that make it really probable that we're going to be able to solve some of these problems in a robust and exciting way. Okay, so I'll just leave it there and just say thanks to the people who paid for all this research and all of the people who did this research from the Music Lab. Please check us out online, participate in our studies, and yeah, I'm really interested in your questions and thoughts, and also in starting up some collaborations across academia and industry. So yeah, thanks.